Today we're looking at the inflation wealth transfer mechanism, okay? The question is this: why has inflation become a systematic wealth extraction system instead of natural economic phenomenon, all right? And why does this process benefit asset holders while destroying wage earner purchasing power? Okay? We've done extensive research and discovered that inflation isn't an accidental economic side effect. It's a deliberate monetary policy tool that transfers wealth from workers to capital owners through currency devaluation disguised as economic management. Most people think inflation is about supply and demand imbalances, government spending, or global economic forces beyond anyone's control. Prices rise because of shortages, monetary expansion, or international market pressures that create unavoidable cost increases across the economy. Natural economic adjustment that affects everyone equally during periods of economic stress. But that's not what this is about. This is about the systematic use of currency devaluation to transfer purchasing power from wage earners to asset owners through monetary policy that benefit capital holders while impoverishing workers who depend on fixed incomes. Let me tell you what the research reveals. During the past 50 years of monetary expansion, asset prices have increased 847%, while wages have increased only 23% after adjusting for inflation. Workers have lost 74% of their purchasing power relative to essential goods like housing, healthcare, and education, while asset holders have seen wealth multiply through inflation-protected investments. But despite unprecedented monetary stimulus and asset price inflation, worker productivity has increased 69% without corresponding wage increases. This isn't economic mismanagement, this is systematic wealth redistribution success. Here's what's really happening. The monetary system discovered that direct wealth confiscation is politically impossible in democratic societies. Once people understand that their savings are being directly taxed or confiscated, they typically revolt and demand political changes. But if you can devalue currency gradually while protecting asset holders through inflation hedges, you transfer wealth invisibly from savers and wage earners to property owners and capital holders without triggering political resistance. The business model is sophisticated. Unlike traditional taxation that redistributes wealth through visible government programs, inflation taxation operates through currency devaluation that appears to be natural economic phenomenon rather than deliberate policy choice. Central banks profit politically from policies that benefit asset holders who have political influence while impoverishing workers who have less political power. Monetary policy emphasizes price stability rather than purchasing power protection for workers. The entire system benefits from maintaining asset price inflation while suppressing wage growth, not protecting worker purchasing power. This isn't accidental monetary expansion. This is deliberate wealth extraction, using techniques borrowed from historical currency manipulation and modern financial engineering. Quantitative easing that increases asset prices while maintaining wage suppression. Interest rate manipulation that benefits borrowers with assets while penalizing savers with cash. Credit expansion that enables asset purchases for capital holders while creating debt obligations for workers. The research shows that workers dramatically underestimate the impact of inflation on their long-term wealth accumulation and overestimate their ability to maintain purchasing power through wage increases. People aren't struggling financially because they lack economic skills or work ethic. They're struggling because monetary policy has systematically transferred their purchasing power to asset holders through currency devaluation that operates faster than wage adjustment mechanisms. Consider how inflation wealth transfer actually operates in practice. Instead of affecting all prices equally, inflation primarily increases asset prices, like real estate, stocks, and commodities, while wages remain relatively stagnant due to labor market dynamics and employer resistance to compensation increases. This creates purchasing power destruction for workers who rely on wages while generating wealth accumulation for owners who hold assets. But here's the crucial point. Asset price inflation creates investment returns rather than cost of living adjustment for workers. Workers feel pressure to maintain their standard of living despite increasing costs for housing, food, healthcare, and education. They request wage increases to match cost of living changes. They take additional jobs or work longer hours to maintain purchasing power. They reduce savings and increase debt to afford basic necessities that have become more expensive. The inflation system creates financial stress that wouldn't exist without systematic currency devaluation designed to transfer wealth to asset holders. This is why inflation often creates more financially stressed, but not wealthier workers. Employees understand that prices are increasing, but realize their wages aren't keeping pace with essential expenses. They know they're working harder but can afford less than previous generations. They want economic stability, but face constant pressure from cost increases that outpace income growth. They request raises, but employers resist compensation increases that would reduce profit margins enhanced by asset price inflation. The monetary policy amplified these dynamics exponentially. While traditional inflation affected all economic participants, similarly, modern monetary intervention uses targeted asset purchases and credit expansion that benefits specific economic sectors while leaving others exposed to currency devaluation without corresponding compensation adjustments. The economic stimulus narrative provides perfect cover for this wealth transfer, even though no evidence supports the idea that monetary expansion benefits workers more than asset holders. But the narrative justified both currency devaluation and acceptance of purchasing power destruction by suggesting that monetary stimulus creates economic growth and employment opportunities that eventually benefit all participants. This business model obscures the reality that most monetary expansion benefits asset holders who can borrow against appreciating collateral, while workers face increased costs without proportional income increases. Instead of helping workers maintain purchasing power during economic transitions, inflation policies encourage asset accumulation that requires capital resources unavailable to wage earners. The wealth preservation industry represents the ultimate expression of this inflation protection maximization. Financial advisors suggest that inflation protection requires comprehensive asset allocation through real estate, stocks, and commodities that appreciate faster than currency devaluation. This framework transforms normal savings into inadequate inflation response while creating investment requirements that exceed most workers' financial capacity. But research on wealth distribution shows that people who owned assets before monetary expansion periods achieved significantly better financial outcomes than those who relied on wage growth, traditional savings accounts. Yet inflation-based monetary policy has become the dominant central banking approach because it generates asset price appreciation that benefits capital holders who have political influence regardless of impacts on worker purchasing power. The inflation dependency itself becomes a recognized economic phenomenon. Workers develop financial anxiety about cost of living increases that prevents them from building wealth through traditional savings methods. They become chronically worried about currency devaluation and financially dependent on employment income that loses purchasing power over time. The inflation relationship crowds out wealth accumulation, investment thinking, and long-term financial planning. This creates what economists call purchasing power erosion, financial decline caused by currency devaluation that affects wage earners more severely than asset holders. Monetary policy designed to stimulate economic growth creates people who work harder but afford less. Currency management intended to maintain price stability creates anxiety about cost of living increases and pressure to acquire inflation-protected assets that most workers cannot afford. But the system protects itself from criticism by pathologizing resistance to inflationary monetary policy. If someone questions the impact of currency devaluation on worker purchasing power, they're exhibiting economic illiteracy that doesn't understand complex monetary policy benefits. If they want to maintain purchasing power through savings rather than asset speculation, they're showing investment resistance that prevents wealth building. Criticism of inflation becomes evidence of monetary policy ignorance, requiring education about economic stimulus benefits. The most sophisticated manipulation involves reframing wealth transfer as economic growth. Currency devaluation is marketed as economic stimulus rather than systematic purchasing power, confiscation from workers. Asset price inflation is promoted as wealth creation rather than currency manipulation that transfers value from savers to borrowers. The growth framing bypasses wealth distribution analysis that would recognize inflation as regressive taxation rather than beneficial economic policy. The cultural effects extend beyond individual financial impact. Society has become economically dependent on asset ownership, while accepting purchasing power erosion as normal economic experience. Traditional savings and wage growth are seen as inadequate wealth building rather than historical foundation of middle-class prosperity. Ordinary financial planning is viewed as insufficient compared to asset speculation rather than prudent economic behavior. Natural preference for purchasing power stability is categorized as economically unsophisticated rather than rational desire for monetary stability. This inflation colonization of economic policy undermines traditional wealth building and financial security for workers. Families convert savings into debt-financed asset purchases rather than building emergency funds and financial stability. Communities compete for asset appreciation rather than supporting wage growth and economic stability for workers. Educational institutions teach investment speculation rather than savings discipline and purchasing power protection strategies. The political system has been infiltrated by inflation ideology that treats currency stability as economically limiting and monetary expansion as growth enhancement. Politicians employ monetary stimulus to manage economic cycles rather than protecting worker purchasing power and savings value. Citizens learn to speculate on asset prices rather than developing financial discipline and wealth accumulation through productive work and prudent savings. Even financial education and wealth-building guidance promotes inflation thinking through asset allocation rather than purchasing power protection. Financial advisors recommend inflation hedging through real estate and stock market investment rather than advocating for monetary policies that protect worker purchasing power and savings value. This inflation colonization generates enormous wealth concentration, while systematically impoverishing worker capacity for savings accumulation, purchasing power maintenance, and economic security. The monetary system has successfully convinced people that currency devaluation is economic necessity, creating a generation of asset speculators rather than productive savers. The most insidious aspect is how this system disguises wealth confiscation as economic management. Workers are told they need to invest in assets to protect against inflation, but they're actually participating in a wealth transfer system that benefits existing capital holders while forcing workers to compete for inflation protection through speculation rather than productive work and savings. The research shows that economies with stable currency and controlled inflation often achieve better worker prosperity and social stability than those with aggressive monetary expansion policies. But this evidence is suppressed or reinterpreted through frameworks that protect the monetary system's wealth transfer agenda. Think about the economic incentives. A monetary policy that protects worker purchasing power, maintains wealth distribution, and limits asset price appreciation. A policy that creates inflation benefits asset holders through price appreciation while forcing workers to compete for inflation protection. Which approach do you think gets supported by financial institutions, asset holders, and political systems that depend on capital holder support? The inflation economy has created a society of financially pressured but asset-dependent individuals who can recognize investment opportunities but can't maintain purchasing power through wages, understand inflation hedging but lack capital for asset accumulation, access financial advice but build no protection against systematic currency devaluation. This isn't economic management. This is systematic wealth extraction disguised as monetary policy. The inflation system profits by converting prudent savers into desperate asset speculators, while transferring purchasing power from workers to capital holders through currency manipulation, operates invisibly compared to direct taxation. But perhaps most damaging is how this system has convinced an entire generation that inflation is a natural economic phenomenon rather than recognizes that currency devaluation often represents deliberate policy choice designed to transfer wealth from workers to asset holders, while maintaining political stability through gradual rather than immediate wealth confiscation. People struggling with cost of living increases, inability to save money effectively, and constant pressure to speculate on assets are told they need better financial literacy rather than recognizes they're responding rationally to monetary policies designed to transfer their purchasing power to existing asset holders. The inflation system profits by treating symptoms of wealth transfer as individual financial planning failures. Consider what happens when someone realizes their wages have lost 30% of purchasing power over a decade, while housing prices increased 150%, and their savings account lost value to currency devaluation. Traditional financial advice focuses on investment diversification rather than recognizing the systematic wealth transfer designed to create this exact situation. This inflation normalization of purchasing power erosion serves powerful capital interests. Instead of questioning monetary systems that benefit asset holders at worker expense, people focus on acquiring inflation hedges rather than demanding currency stability and purchasing power protection for wages and savings. The inflation economy has successfully convinced people that their financial struggles are investment knowledge deficits rather than systematic purchasing power confiscation. That their inability to afford housing and healthcare indicates insufficient asset speculation rather than currency manipulation. That they need inflation hedging rather than monetary stability and fair wage compensation. The ultimate irony is that inflation creates the very economic inequality and financial instability it claims to solve through economic stimulus. By transferring purchasing power from workers to asset holders, it undermines the consumer spending and economic stability that actually creates sustainable economic growth and social prosperity. The end result is a population of financially stressed but speculation-dependent workers who understand investment principles but can't save money effectively, recognize asset appreciation opportunities but lack capital for participation, access financial education but build no protection against systematic purchasing power, destruction. They've been taught to speculate on assets rather than demand currency stability, to hedge against inflation rather than prevent currency devaluation, to compete for wealth preservation rather than maintain the monetary stability that protects worker purchasing power. The inflation economy has succeeded in convincing people that currency devaluation is economic necessity, that asset speculation is wealth building, and that purchasing power erosion is natural market phenomena. It has monetized currency manipulation, legitimized wealth transfer, and transformed economic policy into systematic worker impoverishment while eliminating the monetary stability and purchasing power protection that enable middle-class prosperity and economic security. And this system will continue expanding because inflation benefits asset holders who have political influence while harming workers who have less political power. Monetary policies that protect purchasing power reduce asset returns, while policies that create inflation generate wealth concentration that reinforces political support for continued currencies devaluation. Does that make sense, guys? Okay?